The stars, my destination. Part 1. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Blake said that. Prologue. This was a golden age, a time of high adventure, rich living, and hard dying. Has nobody thought so? This was a future of fortune and theft, pillage and rapine, culture and vice, but nobody admitted it. This was an age of extremes, a fascinating century of freaks, but nobody loved it. All the habitable worlds of the solar system were occupied. 3 planets and 8 satellites and 11 million people swarmed in one of the most exciting ages ever known. Yet minds still yearned for other times. As always, the solar system seethed with activity, fighting, feeding, and breeding, learning the new technologies that spewed forth almost before the old had been mastered, girding itself for the first exploration of the far stars in deep space. But where are the new frontiers? The romantics cried, unaware that the frontier of the mind had opened in a laboratory in Callisto at the turn of the 24th century. A researcher named Jaunt set fire to his bench and himself accidentally, and let out a yell for help with particular reference to a fire extinguisher. Was so surprised as Jaunt and his colleagues when he found himself standing alongside said extinguisher 70 feet removed from his lab bench. They put Jaunt out and went into the whys and wherefores of his instantaneous 70-foot journey. Teleportation. The transportation of oneself through space by an effort of the mind alone had long been a theoretic concept, and there were a few hundred badly documented proofs that it had happened in the past. This was the first time that it had ever taken place before professional observers. They investigated the Jaunt effect savagely. This was soothing, too earth-shaking to handle with kid gloves, and Jaunt was anxious to make his name immortal. He made his will and said farewell to his friends. Jaunt knew he was going to die, because his fellow researchers were determined to kill him, if necessary. There was no doubt about that. Very interesting. I don't know what's going on. 12 psychologists, parapsychologists, and neurometrists of varying specialization were called in as observers. The experimenters sealed Jaunt into an unbreakable crystal tank. They opened a water valve, feeding water into the tank, and let Jaunt watch them smash the valve handle. It was impossible to open the tank. It was impossible to stop the flow of water. The theory was that if it had required the threat of death to goad Jaunt into teleporting himself in the first place, they damn well threatened him with death again. The tank filled quickly. The observers collected data with the tense precision of an eclipse camera crew. Jaunt began to drown. Then he was outside the tank. Bing! It worked. Dripping and coughing explosively, he teleported again. Just threaten my life and I will teleport too. The experts examined and questioned him. They studied graphs and x-rays, neural patterns and body chemistry. They began to get an inkling of how Jaunt had teleported. On the technical grapevine, this had to be kept secret. They sent out a call for suicide volunteers. They were still in the primitive stage of teleportation. Death was the only spur they knew. They briefed the volunteers thoroughly. Jaunt lectured on what he had done and how he thought he had done it. Then they proceeded to murder the volunteers. They drowned them, hanged them, burned them. They invented new forms of slow and controlled death. There was never any doubt in any of the subjects that death was the object. 80% of the volunteers died, and the agonies and remorse of their murderers would make a fascinating and horrible study. But that was no place in this history, except to highlight the monstrosity of the times. 80% of the volunteers died, but 20% jaunted. The name became a word almost immediately. Bring back the romantic age, the romantics pleaded, when men could risk their lives in high adventure. The body of knowledge grew rapidly. By the first decade of the 24th century, the principles of jaunting were established, and the first school was opened by Charles Fort Jaunt himself, then 57, immortalized and ashamed to admit that he had never dared jaunt again. But the primitive days were past. It was no longer necessary to threaten a man with death to make him teleport. They had learned how to teach a man to recognize, discipline, and exploit yet another resource of his limitless mind. How exactly did men teleport? One of the most unsatisfactory explanations was provided by Spencer Thompson, publicity representative of the Jaunt schools, in a press interview. Thompson: "Jaunting's like seeing. It's a natural aptitude of almost every human organism, but it can only be developed by training and experience. Reporter. You mean we couldn't see without practice? Obviously, you're either unmarried or have no children, preferably both. Blah, laughter. I don't understand. I don't understand. Anyone who's observed an infant learning to use his eyes would. But what is teleportation? The transportation of oneself from one locality to another by an effort of the mind alone. You mean we can think ourselves from, say, New York to Chicago? Precisely, provided one thing is clearly understood. In jaunting from New York to Chicago, it is necessary for the person teleporting himself to know exactly where he is when he starts and where he's going. How's that? If you were in a dark room and unaware of where you were, it would be impossible to jaunt anywhere with safety. And if you knew where you were but intended to jaunt to a place you'd never seen, you would never arrive alive. One cannot jaunt from an unknown departure point to an unknown destination. Both must be known, memorized, and visualized. But if we know where we are and where we're going, we can pretty sure we'll joint and arrive. Would we arrive naked? If you started naked, I mean, would our clothes teleport us? When people teleport, they also teleport the clothes they wear and whatever they're strong enough to carry. I hate to disappoint you, but even ladies' clothes would arrive with them. But how do we do it? How do we do it? How do we think? With our minds. I mean, how do we think? With our minds. And how does the mind think? What is the thinking process? Exactly how do we remember, imagine, deduce, and create? Exactly how do the brain cells operate? I don't know. Nobody knows. And nobody knows exactly how we teleport either. But we know we can do it, just as we know that we can think. Have you ever heard of Descartes or Descartes? He said, Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. We say, cogito ergo jaunteo. I think, therefore I jaunt. If it is thought that Thomson's explanation is exasperating, inspect this report of Sir John Kelvin to the Royal Society on the mechanism of jaunting. We've established that the teleportive ability is associated with the Nissi bodies, or tigroid substance in nerve cells. The tigroid substance is easiest demonstrated by Nissi's method using 3.75 grams of methylene blue and 1.75 grams of Venetian soap dissolved in 1,000 cc's of water. Where the tigroid substance does not appear, jaunting is impossible. Teleportation is a tigroid function. Any man was capable of jaunting, provided he developed two faculties, visualization and concentration. He had to visualize completely and precisely the spot to which he desired to teleport himself, and he had to concentrate the latent energy of his mind into a single thrust to get him there. Above all, he had to have faith. The faith that Charles Fort Jaunt never recovered. He had to believe he would jaunt. The slightest doubt would block the mind thrust necessary for teleportation. The limitations with which every man is born necessarily limited the ability to jaunt. Some could visualize magnificently and set the coordinates of their destination with precision, but lacked the power to get there. Others had the power, but could not, so to speak, see where they were jaunting, and space set a final limitation, for no man had ever jaunted further than 1,000 miles. He would work his way in jaunting jumps over land and water from Nome to Mexico, but no jump could exceed 1,000 miles. By the 2420s, this form of employment application blank had become commonplace. It says, this space reserved for retina patterned identification. Name, last, middle, first. Residence, continent, country, jaunt class, official rating, check one only. 1,000 miles, 500, 100, 50, 10, 5 miles. That's all you can jaunt? I can jaunt like 1,000.